Black bear and Furbearer biologist. So I'm the state biologist who is responsible for managing and providing management recommendations for bears, as well as the 14 Furbearer species in Massachusetts. So those are your mesocarnivores, as well as beaver, muskrat, and some other species. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about general black bear ecology and biology, transition into the work and the research we do to monitor the population, to get the information we use to make our management recommendations and decisions. So the results of some of that research, or some information on that research, and then transitioning into what you can do. As Brad was talking about, the actions you can take as individuals to help bears and in also other wildlife, but really to help bears do better in our state. Or Brad said there's some folks from other states as well. The messaging here that I'm going to share about bears really goes across state boundaries, across the country. The messaging over and over and over is the same, and it really is not providing those food sources to bears around your homes and communities to try to prevent conflict. I'll talk about it later. That we often hear the term nuisance bear, problem bear. That's really a misnomer in my eyes. It's essentially a bear being bear and simply taking advantage of the food sources we provide around our homes. We are talking about the American black bear. This is the only black bear in the eastern U.S. Adult males can be quite large. We definitely have bears 400, 500, 600 pounds in Massachusetts. They are solitary with the exception of the mating season, when they expand their range, move large distances, and are trying to interact with and mate with as many females as they can at that time. Adult females can be anywhere from around 140 to over 300 pounds. 300 pounds really is an exceptionally large female for us. And the big difference that you see there is typically the 140, 160 pound female is quite common for a bear that's using entirely natural areas. So we tend to see these in the Berkshires, some other more forested and natural areas in the state. And basically, those are bears that are entirely dependent on natural foods. Our bears that use more developed areas, suburbs, where their diets are supplemented by human associated foods, easily for them to be 200, 225, 245 or more pounds. So those differences really are the foods that are available to them. Black bears give birth to cubs, generally speaking, every other year. And I'm talking briefly about that life cycle right now. So yearling cubs that have spent a little over a year with their mother typically disperse in the spring. So April and May, they're dispersing just prior to the breeding season. The breeding season for bears peaks in June. So this is when they're mating. Bears do something that's called delayed implantation. So this means they mate, the eggs are fertilized at this time, they begin embryonic development, but then it pauses. Those eggs don't implant in the uterus, and so the pregnancy doesn't continue to develop, and it is essentially paused for a period of time. For the rest of the summer and into the fall, that female is by herself, just being a bear, finding food, moving around, doing her thing. Very regularly, right around November 1st for us, it's plus or minus a week maybe, but very, very regularly at this time, the pregnant females enter the den. This is where their physiology tells them that it's time. This is when the egg now implants in the uterine wall. We now begin to have fetal development. The cubs are born while she's in the den, typically, basically right now. Mid-January is when we've seen in recent times that almost all of our females are giving birth to cubs. We've already heard cubs at dens this winter when we're checking and trying to find those dens. For the remainder of the winter, those cubs are growing, getting stronger, based solely on mom's milk. So the female is not leaving the den. When bears are in the den, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't defecate. And so she's producing milk for those cubs to grow and survive simply off her fat reserves and her body reserves. And that's what's keeping her alive as well. She's going to typically emerge around April 1st is when, plus or minus a little bit, when they emerge from the den. And for the rest of the year, she's basically showing those cubs how to be bears. where to find food, how to find food in a place like Massachusetts and in the Northeast, how to navigate the human-dominated landscape, crossroads, avoid people to the greatest extent possible. The cubs are weaned by late summer. And then those females with the 1-year-old cubs, those cubs are going to den with her again as 1-year-old cubs. In that, when they enter the den, and the same with males, is highly variable. It can be strongly influenced by the availability of food, but it's kind of irregular what the cause of that could be. If you have abundant natural foods, bears may stay active for longer because there's food available to them, or because they've had enough to eat, they may den earlier. So it can be hugely variable, and same as if you had a drought or a lack of food some year, it can really shift when bears are entering the dens. And every winter we have bears that stay active all winter, particularly in suburban areas. The availability of reliable food sources at bird feeders, most notably, actually precludes the need for them to have to den in winter. They're in the den typically till a shorter period of time than those females that are giving birth to newborn cubs, emerging sometime mid-February to mid-March. And then for the spring, she's basically now showing those cubs, continuing to show them how to find spring foods, how to survive, disperse, as I said, around 1 year, 4 or 5 months, and they're on their own for the rest of their lives prior to the breeding season again, and where this cycle will repeat itself. Black bears are opportunistic omnivores. Omnivores, obviously, meaning they will eat both plants and animals. Opportunistic omnivores, meaning bears will eat just about anything. They really, almost anything is seen as a food source for them. But almost all the black bear diet is vegetation. They're almost everything, 95%, is going to be plant-based. In the spring, there's not a lot of food for bears. They're really eating the first vegetation that emerges. Often it's in wetlands. Fortunately, it's a high protein, high nutritious food. Skunk cabbage in wetlands, very, very important food for bears in the spring where it's available. They'll also eat leftover nuts, acorns, hickory nuts that have overwintered from the previous fall, carrion. So they'll scavenge on the carcasses of dead animals. And this is really the main time of year where they will actually exhibit predatory behavior, is they will prey on deer fawns shortly after deer fawns are given birth. Before deer fawns are highly susceptible to predation in the first week or two of life before they start to get highly mobile. And really, that's the only time of year where bears can feed on them, and they will opportunistically and do opportunistically feed on them. As I mentioned, relatively speaking, food is pretty scarce in the spring, so we do tend to see high use of human-associated foods, particularly bird feeders in the spring. So they're definitely attracted to neighborhoods and suburban areas at this time. Throughout the year, habitat use of bears is going to be determined by where they can find food. And so in the spring, we do tend to see that it's dominated by wetlands. As the seasons progress and different foods become available, bear diet is going to shift to take advantage of those food sources. In the summer, some important food sources are colonial insects. So this is ants, bees, wasps. And so bears will dig their nests out of the ground, out of rotten logs and stumps, and they'll eat the insects, their larvae, honey out of those. Fruits, so soft fruits are extremely important natural food for bears in the summer. So as soon as the first strawberries become available in early summer, then blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, our black cherry trees, grapes, apples, they take advantage of all those foods, very important natural food. Unfortunately, they will also take advantage of crops, corn and apple being the two biggest, and bears can do an extraordinary amount of damage in a cornfield in a short period of time. They'll basically go into the field and just kind of park there, and they'll just flatten the corn and really gorge themselves on the corn and cause a lot of damage for farmers. Habitat use tends to be in upland forest, logged areas. Logged areas provide great habitat for a variety of wildlife species. But for bears, for example, the down woody debris that results from logging can be great places for them to dig and find those colonial insects that I talked about. But the openings in the forest are also great for producing blackberries and blueberries. So lots of food available there. They're also found in wetlands and orchards at these times. In late summer, in fall, bears enter what's called the state of hyperphagia. This is basically their compulsion to eat as much as they possibly can to start gaining the weight they need for hibernation. This is really the time of year where bears really start to pack on the pounds. And you've seen an example of this. You've probably seen an example of this if you've seen the fat bear contest that Fish and Wildlife Service holds from the bears in Katmai in Alaska on the salmon runs. Basically, the bears just gorging themselves on salmon, and they'll put on hundreds of pounds of weight at this time of year. For us, bears again continue to eat the crops at this time of year, but the most important natural food for them is going to be our hard mast. And so this is the fruit from our nutting trees, so oaks that produce acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts, important fall foods. They'll also take advantage of deer carcasses and gut piles from the hunting season is an opportunistic meal for them. In the fall, we tend to see them in upland, forests, fields, and orchards. I talked about when bears hibernate before, but why do they hibernate? Often people think, well, it's gotten cold, so bears have to be in the den, or there's a bit of snow on the ground, so bears have to be in the den. And that's really not the case at all. Bears have a thick fur coat, much thicker than a deer, for example, has that remains active all winter. They've got a thick layer of fat on them. They're fully capable of dealing with the cold. And often bears will they'll just make a nest on the ground, completely exposed to the elements, and that's where they decide they're going to sleep for the winter. So it's not the cold; it's an adaptation to the lack of food for winter. For them in winter because they're primarily vegetarians. And unlike deer or moose or rabbits, they can't digest, they don't have the digestive system to digest woody vegetation, twigs and stems and hemlock needles and those kind of things. There's really nothing for them to eat in winter. And so they go to the den and they live off their reserves. What this means is that they have to, in the 7, 8, 9 months that they're active, they now have to gain all the weight and the fat reserves they need to survive hibernation. And this means bears have evolved and adapted to search for calorie-rich foods throughout the year. This is essentially quintessentially what a bear is. Unfortunately, and we'll talk a lot about this at the end of the talk, we as modern society readily supply these foods around our homes, notably in bird feeders, unsecured garbage, increasingly with small livestock. All of these are irresistible meals for a bear. Now, I'll say it again, this is just what a bear is. It is driven to eat, and it's going to take advantage of these foods whenever it can. This is the range of bears in Massachusetts. This blue-gray area is where we have established females, established reproduction. The brown area is kind of our expanding range. The black bear population in Massachusetts is growing and expanding. This is the continued long-term recovery of our bear population following European colonization. Particularly in Worcester County and central Massachusetts, for the past half dozen or more years, our population has really been increasing very rapidly, and bears are continuing to expand further and further to the east. As you'll see, I'll talk about bears moving through northeast and southeast Mass in a minute. We do likely have, well, I'll say bears are expanding, but you can see all these major highways. So this is Interstate 495, Interstate 190, the Mass Pike, Interstate 84, the city of Worcester is here. All of these things provide barriers for the real expansion of our range. And obviously, it takes females to become established on the other side of some of these barriers before the population can really grow there. Otherwise, it's just males dispersing into those areas looking for territories. Females don't move far from their mother's range typically when they typically occupy a portion of their mother's range when they disperse. And so it takes a female to bridge this gap before, we start to see further progression. So this has kind of been where our range has been stalled for a number of years now. As I mentioned, historically, we had bears all the way to the coast in Massachusetts. Following European colonization, like throughout most of the eastern United States, large amounts of our forested habitat were cut down and converted into farmland. I think we lost almost 80% of the forested habitat in Massachusetts. Additionally, wildlife agencies didn't exist, and so there were no hunting regulations. You could hunt bears and other species year-round for food because the animals were seen as pests for their fur. And so essentially, we drove the bear population in Massachusetts back to the northern Berkshires. And it's the slow recovery of that population that led us to where we have bears now. One of the best ways to look at where we have bears and the growth of our population is looking at where bears were taken in the hunting season in Massachusetts. Starting around 1970 is when we kind of entered our modern hunting framework. This is the time where the attitudes across the eastern United States towards bears started to change, where they were no longer seen as a pest species, but were seen as a valuable species, an important part of our natural communities. And hunting seasons and hunting regulations were put in place to help to grow their populations and recover their populations throughout the East. So if we look at 1980, we took 10 bears in the short hunting season, all centered around where that population was in the northern Berkshires. By 1990, bears had rapidly spread. They'd crossed the Connecticut River and become established in central Massachusetts. They crossed the Mass Pike and were becoming, shortly after this, established in Connecticut. And we can see 10 years later, the population is continuing to expand. You can now see we're taking 4, 5, 6 bears in individual towns in the hunting season. It's just a year after this that the first bear was taken east of the Connecticut River. And, this pattern continues. By 2010, you can see that we're starting to have occur what happened back in 1980 in Western Mass in central Massachusetts, where the range of bears is expanding, the density of bears is starting to increase, and you can see this mirrored in where bears are taken in the hunting season. As you recall, I mentioned just a second ago that in the 1990s, bears from Massachusetts became established in Connecticut. Now, 20 years later, or 30 years later, we're now seeing that we take large numbers of bears along the Connecticut border. Connecticut does not have a hunting season. They're one of the only states that has a well-established bear population that does not have any hunting. And because of this, their population has essentially grown unchecked since then. So there's now high densities of bears along the Massachusetts border. Connecticut provides another really good example of one of the benefits of having hunting season. Connecticut is an outlier in the Northeast compared to every other state that has hunting seasons in terms of the levels of serious conflict they experience with bears. For the past half dozen years, bears have been entering homes 50, 60 times per year in Connecticut, where we have a handful of incidents, most notably along the Connecticut border. Connecticut's also had a number of incidents where bears have seriously injured people, including attempted predatory attacks by bears on people that we don't experience and haven't fortunately experienced in Massachusetts. And so this is where the benefit of the hunting season is that it, by chance, removes some of these bolder, more aggressive bears, and these more egregious conflict behaviors don't persist in our population. And again, the growth of our population continues to expand further and further to the east. Another way we can look at where we have bears in state is to look at where calls either come into our agency or into the environmental police. Being a law enforcement agency, the environmental police, all the calls that come into their dispatch are recorded. And so you can see that the majority of calls, closely match up with where our established range is. You can also see that there are occasionally a single bear will wander through Southeast Mass or Northeast Mass or, the 495 corridor. And basically I can track that bear on a daily basis by the phone calls that come into me, the calls from the media, the calls from local police departments as they're trying to figure, oh my gosh, there's a bear in Southeast Mass. Is this a public safety threat, et cetera, et cetera. And this pattern has continued in recent years where, a single bear in Northeast Mass counted for over 50 phone calls. Past year, a couple bears in Southeast Mass, many, many, many phone calls. Unfortunately, the majority of these bears, as they're moving through this much more developed portion of the state, have ended up being killed as they're trying to cross some of the interstate highways in this area. But this is an increasing pattern. As I said, our population is increasing. We fully anticipate that we're going to see more and more and more bears moving into Eastern Mass and close to Boston as time moves forward here. Again, this is how we can piece together different pieces of information to know where we have bears and a general idea of what's happening with our bear population, that it's growing and thriving. But as a wildlife biologist, we want to do more, obviously. We want to have greater information as to, what might happen in a bear population in the future. And so don't worry about this figure. This is essentially a depiction of a very, very basic population model. So all I want you to say is over on the left, we want to model a population. We have to have information on the number of cubs, the number of juveniles, the number of adults in the population. What's their chances of surviving to the next year? For our females, What is their birth potential, both from young females and others? If we can gather lots of information, we can predict what's going to happen to the population in the future. In order to get that information, going back to 1980, Mass Wildlife, along with various researchers, graduate students at UMass, have been continuously collaring and monitoring our bear population. And we do that through trapping bears and using radio collars to track their survival and now increasingly their movement as well. Through this, we deploy these 55-gallon drum traps. So this is 2.5 55-gallon drums welded together. There's a tape bag in the end of the trap. The bear crawls in, it grabs that bag, it pulls a wire out from underneath the door, and the door closes behind the bear. Yes, even this very, very, very large male will squeeze himself into that trap to access the food reward. Once the bear's in the trap, we can tranquilize it, immobilize it using a tranquilizer and a syringe on the end of a jab pole. Once the bear's asleep, we can pull it out of the trap and we can work it up. On the right, you can see where occasionally we'll take advantage of a bear moving into a more developed area. So a female with cubs in a tree. Sometimes we can opportunistically go out if we get a call about that, dart the bear, and we can collar on it. And this way we can get information on bears living in these developed places that we otherwise probably wouldn't be trapping and trying to collar bears. Once the bear is immobilized, we are going to obviously determine its sex, assess its condition, weigh it, look for any injuries, and overall just give it a quick health checkup. All of the bears, males and females, get ear tags. These are small ear tags that have a unique number on them. This way, if that bear is later taken in our hunting season, if it's involved in a vehicle collision, if it's involved in nuisance behavior, if it moves into a different state and is taken in their hunting season, we can say, okay, we know we trapped that bear in 2017. In 2023, it was taken in the New Hampshire hunting season. And so you can get pieces of information by doing that. All of our females that are newly trapped are getting GPS collars. So these collars record a location every 45 minutes, and they do that night and day throughout the year. And so we're getting very detailed information on bear habitat use and movements. So we can learn about the natural habitats, the types of forests, young forests that bears are using, wetlands, etc. How often they're in backyards and using developed areas, how often they're using agricultural areas, how they're navigating and moving around in the human-dominated landscape. Are there patterns to where they're crossing roads? And these collars provide a wealth of information for us. These collars and some of the collars we have on our bears also will have some of the collars we have on our bears are just traditional radio collars. These are collars that put out a pulsing signal that we have to go out, listen for that signal, that we can turn to a specific frequency, and we can monitor that bear in that way. In this way, so say this bear, after we've trapped it, after we've collared it, it dies. The signal from that collar will change. We can then go out in the woods and we can attempt to determine the cause of mortality. So this is one of those pieces of information that we can add to our puzzle. And we also know, okay, when we trapped it, how long it survived. Again, information on that survival of the bears. We can also each winter use those collars to track the females to their dens. And we're doing this work right now where we're out and we're identifying the dens that our bears are denned in for the winter. You can see the various different types of dens we encounter. Here's a rock cave. I think a lot of people have the idea in their head that bears den in rock caves. And that's really the exception rather than the rule. Part of that is because those types of rock caves and cavities aren't necessarily super common out there. But more often than not, the bears are denned either up in a hollow tree or at the base of a tree, just down next to a blown over tree. So between the root mass in the trunk of the tree, or just in thick briar, a slash pile, a log pile, or something else. Sometimes they'll dig a burrow in the ground. They'll enlarge a burrow in the ground and den in that. Huge variety of dens, and sometimes they just rake up some leaves and make a big bird nest on the ground and will sleep there all winter, give birth right in the open in the den like that. So once we've identified the dens, later in the winter we'll go out and we try to immobilize the females. So bears aren't true hibernators, so they're basically just taking a nap. So if as we go in on the den, we're making a lot of noise, we're breaking sticks, we're talking, etc., she's going to wake up and she's going to leave, and obviously we're not going to be successful in capturing her. So we try to sneak in as quietly as we possibly can. We try to immobilize her again using that jab pole, but this time a 12-foot jab pole. We have dart guns for backups to in case she were to run to try to immobilize her. Once she's immobilized, we pull her out of the den. Again, we assess her condition, look for injuries, check her weight, take any measurements we need to, and we'll also refit or replace her collar as needed. As I mentioned at the beginning, roughly half of our females have given birth to newborn cubs every winter in the den. For the females that we expect to have newborn cubs, we wait until the end of February, beginning of March to do this work, because the cubs are born right now. That allows the cubs to be 6 or 8 weeks old by the time we're doing this work. In this way, we can determine, okay, this female gave birth to 3 cubs. We can weigh the cubs, assess their condition, determine the sex of the cubs. After we're done working up mom, work up the cubs, we put mom back in the den. We tuck the cubs back in with her. We cover, you can see the pine boughs behind him. We're going to use those to cover up the den to protect her until she recovers from the immobilization drug. And then they're going to spend the rest of the winter in the den, like I said, leaving early April, not knowing really anything happened. But we gained another key piece of information into the cub production of our females. If we repeat this process the following year, if we're successful in immobilizing mom one at a time, we can immobilize the now 1-year-old cubs. And so, for example, here you can see a family of bears on the upper right that we mobilize mom with her ear tags and GPS collar, the male yearling with his ear tags, and the young female with an expandable collar. So we will these expandable collars on the young females. It accommodates her growth for her second year of life. In this way, we've now documented by doing this again, we've documented the survival of the cubs' first year. So the female gave birth to 3 cubs. She has 2 cubs with her this year. We know the survival of her cubs 2 out of 3. By collaring this female, we can now monitor her survival as she's a juvenile. She's going to den by herself for the first time as a 2-year-old. We'll go in on her again, replace this collar with a full-size collar. And now we can determine as we go in on her year after year, when does she give birth to her first litter? Is that litter successful? When does she have subsequent litters? How many cubs does she produce? And ultimately, what is her cause of mortality? So we can start to get a very complete picture of the life history of these animals. And by doing this for a long period of time, we know that we have very high adult female survival rates. And we know that this is the factor that has the greatest impact on whether we have an increasing, a stable, or a declining population. These high survival rates for our adult females have corresponded with this entire period of growth that we've seen in our population. And the survival rates we're seeing today are almost exactly what we've seen throughout the period that we've been conducting this study. We know the age of first reproduction, and this says 3 to 4, but almost invariably now it's 3 years of age. It's a surprise if we go in on a 3-year-old bear and she doesn't have cubs. So very often our bears are giving birth to their first litter at 3. We have information on their average litter size, and we know that the first litter is often 1 to 2 small cubs, and subsequently it will be 2, 3, 4 reasonably robust cubs. Our average is around 2.75 for the number of cubs our bears are giving birth to. We have information on cub survival for that first litter versus subsequent litters. So these 2 dens were happening to be done on back-to-back days. And you can see this cub from a first-time mom. I can basically fit that cub in my hands, tiny, not so robust, not so strong. Whereas these cubs for a mature female in a suburban area, they're brawlers. You can barely hold on to those things. They're ready to tear you up and trying to get away from you as you're trying to do the work. And there are differences in survival. First time litters, the survival rates are much lower than our mature females. Mature females, very successful in successfully raising their cubs. The first time moms, not so much. Part of that can be that they're smaller bears. They don't have the fat reserves that the mature females have, so they lose their milk. They don't produce milk for the cubs as long as the mature females do. Some of it is just that they're naive and they don't know how to raise cubs. The mature females are going to move out of their den and they're going to go to a wetland and they're just going to park there. That wetland provides water, there's food from the skunk cabbage and other vegetation that's in there. And often there's large trees on the side of the wetland. If she senses danger, she sends the cubs up the trees. And so basically she can camp there for a month or so. The cubs get bigger, they get stronger. She can continue to eat and doesn't put them in risky situations. Where the young mom, if you look at the movement rates from the collars, they're moving all over the place. They're crossing roads. They're making those cubs expend energy to keep up with them. They're putting them in risky situations, potentially interacting with male bears, and just the survival isn't very good. But if they lose their cubs, almost invariably, they're going to give birth to another litter the following year, and they'll be successful raising it and successful every other year thereafter. We also have information on causes of mortality. We know that there is almost no natural mortality in our bear population, and this goes through the entire length of the study. There have been a handful of bears that have died of natural causes. The causes are our hunting season, vehicle collisions, and nuisance kills by the public, but otherwise very little natural mortality. And by using this information and using a simple model like I showed you at the beginning, we've projected the growth of our population over time. What I know is that if I would use this simple model today, that it would tell me that I have a very unreasonably high density of bears in Massachusetts, a huge number of bears. I know that's not realistic, but what I do know is that the demographic rates, so the survival rates, the reproductive rates that we're monitoring and seeing today are equivalent to what we've seen throughout the period of population growth that we have, and we're highly confident in the health and the status of our bear population. And other factors are showing us the growth of our population as well. When I first started putting GPS collars on bears around 2009, 2010, there were huge differences in home range size east and west of the Connecticut River. East of the river, we had home ranges that were over 200 square miles. And the further you moved east towards Worcester, the larger they got. West of the Connecticut River, they were 40 square kilometers. And this was essentially high densities of bears. West of the Connecticut River, the bears were packed in and used small territories. In the east, there weren't that many bears around. They could use a large territory, and they did. Over the years, we've watched these territories shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. So this is an example of a portion of data that we would get from any one of the GPS collars. So each one of these different colors is from a different colored female, and each one of the dots is one of those 45-minute locations of the collars. And so you can see here's 7 females here just using this small area between the west arm of the Quabbin and the Connecticut River here. Here's UMass campus right here. This isn't all the bears. We also have this many females collared in the same area with VHF collars. So these are conventional radio collars. We've historically had GPS collar data from these females, but they now have a conventional radio collar. And we know where they live. They're living in these areas as well. Years ago, we trapped 3 new females in this area. This past year, while attempting to trap bear, which was the 2-year-old offspring of the VHF collared female there, we trapped 3 new females that use this area. And another female over here. It begins to show you now the rapidly increasing density of bears in this portion of the state. And again, this is just the females. You see spots in the map here. That's just because we haven't trapped in that area. More females there. We don't have all the females captured in these areas where we do have lots of bears. These aren't the juveniles. These aren't the males. So you start to get a picture of the very, very high densities of bears that we're getting in these areas. Another aspect of the research that we've been doing is taking the data we get from these collars and learning about how bears are moving on the landscape. And we had a postdoc a number of years ago who did some really cool analyses on the data, looking at how bears were navigating the landscape, how they're moving through the highly fragmented human-dominated landscape. For example, here's some data from one of our females. This is the Holyoke Range, the Connecticut River. This is Westover Air Force Base down here. This is a highly fragmented landscape, lots and lots of human development, lots of road networks. And you can see that it's very patchy how she's moving through there. Over on the left, this is Mount Toby, large block of conservation land, but then open agricultural lands here that you can see, again, patchy use of that area. So she did some analyses that looked at how both the natural features of the landscape, so the forests of different types, the wetlands, these different features, as well as the man-made features, so the agricultural lands, the low-density residential areas, the high-density residential areas, the commercial areas, affected bears' ability to move across the landscape. The result of that model was essentially a probability surface. Excuse me. So this is basically high probability of a bear moving through in green. Brown is a low probability of moving. Not surprisingly, bears move through natural areas better than they do developed areas. For example, this is the city of Greenfield, Massachusetts. Interstate 91. You can see the Connecticut River snaking down through here, Turner's Fall. And so again, we now have this picture of how bears might see the landscape in Massachusetts as they might move through it. We can take this, and she did take this one step further by creating a lot of fake bears, pseudo bears on this landscape. So she created a lot of starting points, and she said like thousands of starting points across the entire state, and said, all right, I want this fake bear to move from this starting point to every other one of the points on the map, moving through this landscape using the green portions of the map and avoiding the brown portions. Essentially moving through the areas that help bear movement and avoiding those that didn't. The result of this, as you do this many times, is that some of those movement paths between those places move through the same areas. You see these dark green lines, these are where you have many movement paths moving through the same spot. Whereas you can see some of these thin green lines, these are places where you have, in the lighter green lines, where you have maybe just one or two. So in this way, we've identified potentially important movement corridors on the landscape for bears and potentially other wildlife in Massachusetts. We're now using this data to work with Mass DOT. I'll say that Mass DOT is now the entity that is providing the funding for our GPS collars. And we're working with Mass DOT. So say they have a construction project on this stretch of Route 2. You can look at this and say, okay, hey, this is potentially a place where there's an important wildlife movement corridor. And we incorporate something into the design of this construction project that helps bears move across the highway? Can we use larger culverts? If it's a stream underpass, can we provide a bench that allows wildlife to move underneath the roadway? Basically trying to minimize the impacts of our very extensive road network on wildlife in Massachusetts. So this is one of the ways that the hands-on ways that our research on bears is being used to help conservation in the state. So now I'm going to transition kind of into the second part of the talk, and this is where, Brad's comment before about, the actions that you can take as individuals and communities to help bear conservation, and the messaging for bear here also applies to other wildlife in the state as well. And so these should be good landmarks for you: the city of Amherst, Northampton, the Holyoke Range, the Quabbin. I'm now going to put our bear GPS color data on here. Again, each one of the clusters of a different color is a different bear. These are all females. These are just the bears that we had captured up to about 2018. That's when I made this figure. You can see the city of Northampton disappears under bears. You can see much of the area disappears under bears. And we didn't by any means have all of the females captured. Again, you see these blank areas in the map. That's just because we hadn't trapped in those places. So I show this to you to show you the huge level of interaction there are between bears and people every single day. They're in yards, they're in neighborhoods, they're next to schools, next to playgrounds. Kids are playing in those playgrounds. They're still going out for recess. People are going out, they're walking their dogs, they're hiking, they're jogging, they're biking, they're doing everything without serious conflict. But it just shows the level of conflict, or not the level of conflict, the level of interaction they have, including in very highly developed places. Again, Westover Air Force Base, Chicopee, Holyoke, Ludlow, very developed locations. And these are female bears that are giving birth to and raising cubs in these environments. For example, this is the UMass Amherst campus. This is one of our GPS collar bears. She's now denned on the campus 3 times and given birth to newborn cubs. And we just leave her on there, despite there being, tens of thousands of students. We don't have a concern for safety given the places that she's denned on campus. This type of habitat configuration is exceptionally common throughout Massachusetts, all the way to the inner Boston suburbs. Same thing with Connecticut, Rhode Island, everywhere else in the region that you may be. Where you have larger blocks of forest, you have small strips of forest between neighborhoods, between individual houses. We've got great wetland protection laws here in Massachusetts that provide great. So this all provides great black bear habitat right into and around these neighborhoods. So the challenge for me as the manager of bears, coyotes, other species in the state is how do I convey to the people living in these neighborhoods that are thinking about the kids playing in the yard, biking in the street, a picnic in the backyard, that the decisions they make as individuals and you make as communities determines how much it's this too, how much it is the family bears living in the backyard and her raising her cubs in the backyard. My goal as the manager of bears in the state is to have a healthy, vibrant bear population that we all can enjoy, having them feed on natural food sources, using natural areas, and living compatibly with the human population. But this is where you can do your thing. I can't do this without you. People often turn to us to solve a problem, but it really is up to you as individuals, as communities, to solve these problems for yourselves. Go back to why bears hibernate. Remember, it's this adaptation to the lack of food, and what that means is, again, they're driven, they have this compulsion to eat as much as they can whenever they can. This is inherently what a bear is. This means that they're going to take advantage of human associated foods that we provide around our homes and communities all year. And this is the root cause of human bear conflict. It is simply the inherent nature of a bear. It's not a bad bear that's doing this. The inherent nature of a bear in us providing those foods that bears can take advantage of, and then thinking that it's a bad bear that's doing that. I'll start with the single number one driver of human wildlife conflict there is: bird feeders. That is a fact. It is not opinion. And this doesn't matter whether it's conflict with coyotes, it's conflict with bears, it's conflict with turkeys, other species. Bird feeders drive this conflict. They're what attract these animals. They're what attract squirrels. They're what attract rats and mice to people's yards. They attract the predators to your yards because they come to feed on the birds and the squirrels and the rats and the mice that come to feed at the bird seed. There's all sorts of chains of consequences to this. You attract and you support rodent populations. What do people do? They put out poison to poison those rodents. Now you have poison in the food chain that's now poisoning our foxes, our fishers, our eagles, our owls, our hawks. For bears, unfortunately, this is what leads to bad behaviors. And I'll say this, I should have said this at the beginning, there's no such thing as a bird feeder. It is a wildlife feeder. And for bears, the negative consequences are that these are essentially training these bears that the best place to find food is in your backyard, is in your neighborhood, it's up on your deck, it's around your home. They're smart animals, and they're going to come there time and time and time and time again to feed on these things. And unfortunately, we can't do anything about it. So I borrowed this photo from our old Connecticut River Valley district manager. He had this in one of his presentations, and someone sends you this photo. I've had this phone call with people many times. You have to do something about your bear. It's constantly coming to my house. And you know what the answer is. They've got bird feeders out. And it's like, I can't do anything about that bear. There's nothing I can do as long as you continue to feed. And I could come out. Say I come out and we make the decision, we're going to kill that bear. I'm not going to do that. I've never done that, and I have zero plans to do that. But say I did that. The next bear and the next bear. You saw the densities of bears we have living in these places. The next bear, the next bear, the next bear, and the next bear are all going to do the same thing. I circle the bear in the upper right. We'll talk more about her. She's one of our collared yearlings. So one of those young females that we collared with her mother. As soon as she dispersed from her mom, she was in backyards. We were getting calls about her, up on decks, causing problems, getting into food. Why? Because her mom had taught her from a very young age that the best place to find food was in people's yards and around their homes. And unfortunately, you'll find out later the tragic ending that happened to this bear, but this is a very common tragic ending. Some people tell us they don't mind the fact that bears come. I kind of like to see them. They're not aggressive. They're just there for a meal. I like to see the bears. They don't really bother me. That's not the point. the point is what's happening here. Again, it's training these bears to come up onto people's deck. As they do that, that's when they start to get into problems. That's where they break into someone else's shed looking for birdseed, or they break into a shed trying to access garbage. They go 5 houses down because they've been trained to go yard to yard to yard looking for bird feeders, and they discover that person has beehives, and they destroy their beehives. They go 2 blocks over and they raid a chicken coop. That person has a gun and it shoots the bear. Just this past summer, I had to respond because somebody killed a female that had 4 cubs in the city of Athol. And, people are all outraged. And we're getting questions from the media as to, why this person did this, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, there's a law in Massachusetts that allows you to kill an animal that's causing property damage. Did that person pull the trigger? Yes, they did. But every single person that had fed that bear up to that time led to that event happening. So there are negative consequences for feeding bears, birds, and other wildlife. In case it's not clear enough, no bird feeders. There's no safe time of day. We hear people say, I bring them in at night. What do you notice about all these pictures? Taken during the day. Our collars also show us that our bears are active during the day, not at night. So that doesn't do any good. And we have bears every year that are active all winter feeding at bird feeders. Another big one is bears and garbage. So both household garbage and dumpsters can be major issues and dangerous situations with bears. So if you have household garbage, store your garbage in a secure building, a garage, a shed, put it out the morning of the pickup, not the day or the night before. Put it out to the curb in a bag, not just or in a can, not just in a bag. If you don't have a shed, if you don't have a garage, the state of Florida put together incredibly detailed plans to build these little mini sheds. Florida has a huge problem with bears getting into garbage, largely because of the vacation communities down there. And so this is kind of their number one thing. These are super detailed plans. You do not have to be a handy person in order to build one of these. It tells you every single piece of lumber you need, exactly the measurements. There's pictures, step-by-step instructions how to install one of these things. These are available on our website, mass.gov/bears, and you can click on the links for these designs. Dumpsters create a potentially dangerous situation. This can be at restaurants, apartment complexes, summer camps, RV parks, any place where you have a bunch of people putting garbage in a dumpster. If we have bears that are regularly and you see this bear that's basically just collapsing the plastic lid of this dumpster, it's easy for them to do. And so if bears are regularly in these dumpsters, you now have the chance for a negative encounter between a person and a bear. Say little old Mrs. Johnson goes out at 9 o'clock at night. It's pitch black. She's going to throw her garbage from the day in the dumpster, and the bear happens to be in the dumpster. Or the bear's walking around the dumpster just as she arrives. You now have a bear and Mrs. Johnson face to face. That bear reacts defensively in the dark. It swats Mrs. Johnson. She just had a very, very bad day. And again, this all goes back to the bears regularly feeding in these dumpsters. So there's an easy solution for this. Almost every waste disposal company now will provide metal top dumpsters. It's still important that if you have an overflowing dumpster or the doors are open, you've got to keep the doors closed and latched. If your dumpster is overflowing, you need a second dumpster or get it emptied more often. We've seen time and time again where someone is having big issues with dumpsters and get a metal top dumpster and the problems just go away. So definitely a fairly easy solution for this one, but it does take a little bit of expense to do it. Unquestionably, the biggest form of serious conflict we now experience with bears is bears attacking chickens. And beehives has always been something that's been known in that community. But in recent years, backyard chicken farming has become incredibly popular. The pandemic only increased that. And so this figure grossly estimates the number of backyard chickens there are out there. And remember, this is the bear. And so now as these bears are going yard to yard to yard, feeding bird feeders, they're also encountering chicken coops. And you cannot build a chicken coop that is strong enough to keep a bear out. This is that same bear that we talked about before. Again, mom taught her to feed at bird feeders. She fed at bird feeders when she was a young bear, and she learned chickens and became a habitual chicken coop raider. 2 years ago, we found her collar cut off and thrown in a river. Presumably, someone finally got fed up. They shot her. found she was collared and disposed of the collar because they didn't want to get in trouble. They didn't know that they actually had the right to do that. But this is, again, the chain of events that leads to this happening, or stems with the bird feeders, but it ends up with chickens. And this has become a huge issue. We're trying to encourage everyone who has chickens, bees, small livestock, because we're seeing an increasing number of attacks on sheep and goats as well, to use electric fencing. It is the only thing that's going to prevent bears from accessing your hives, your coop, what have you. And I say here, design and maintain a fence that'll actually achieve that goal. This is a great design. You know, it's a robust, sturdy design. You'll see out there those flimsy net fencing that have a fiberglass post as big as my pinky. That's not going to keep a 100-pound bear out, let alone a 400 or 500-pound bear. So build something that is going to keep them out. We have complete guide on our website. This has the materials, step-by-step instructions, tips how to make this as effective as possible. Again, mass.gov/bears. There's a little tab that says protect your bees, chickens, and livestock. Bam, it's right on there. If you know anyone who has chickens, bees, livestock, please encourage them to use electric fencing. It's available at any farm supply store, your local farm supply store where you're getting your chicks, your feed, etc. It's safe, it's easy to use. Baiting the wires is key. You want to have a piece of aluminum foil with some peanut butter or something on it that's attracting that bear's nose right to the wires, so it gets that message that this is something to be avoided, so that they don't learn and persist with these bad behaviors. Lots of other information. If you're camping, you're hiking, you're recreating in these various places in Massachusetts or elsewhere, mass.gov/bears, lots of resources there. I'll say if you're from another state, many states in the region are using, Bearwise. It's a collaborative project throughout the country about coexisting with bears. Same messaging that you'll find here, but also a good and valuable resource for folks. About to wrap up here. Again, these food sources are why this bear is in the backyard. If you remove and secure those food sources, the bear loses the motivation to come to the yard to try to find these foods. It's going to use natural areas. It's going to look for food in the forest, in the wetlands, where we want our bears to be. As I mentioned, unfortunately, the sows teach their cubs these same behaviors, and they do get bolder as the more comfortable and the more time they spend around people in our yards. That's where the true conflict starts to occur. And again, the more time they spend around people, the greater chances there are of that negative encounter, of something happening while someone's putting the garbage in the garbage can or in a dumpster. A bear's feeding at bird feeders on someone's deck. They open the sliding glass door. The dogs run out. You now have an encounter that ends up negatively. So really, bottom line message is our bears aren't going to change. As I said, this is inherently what a bear is. They're always going to take advantage of these food sources if we provide them to them. So we as individuals, as communities, really must change, must take this message seriously if we want to support bears. And again, this is bear centric, but the same messaging goes for coyotes, for many of our species. I mentioned about the rodenticide issues. A lot of that stems to all of the food that we have around our communities that supports huge rodent populations. People poison them, and there's negative consequences for our wildlife community. So these are a couple simple places and simple ways that you can make change for the benefit of wildlife around your community. Again, this is our goal: healthy bear population, feeding on natural foods, coexisting with people. If you do have conflict, we're always there for you. Again, the website's right there, simple, easy to use. 24/7, you can reach the Environmental Police Dispatch for assistance, or, I have our Belchertown office there. That's the Connecticut River Valley Regional Office, or Westboro office. That's the office I've out of, our main office, to provide assistance if you need assistance. That's it. I'd be happy to take any questions that people have.
Wow, Dave, that was amazing. That's incredible to see, kind of just in the past 20, 30 years, how far the, kind of bear population has come, expanded wise, and the amount that you all have learned to help manage, and track the population.
Yeah, and that recovery of bears has really been mirrored across the entire East. They're thriving and doing very, very well now across the entire Eastern U.S.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm going to go through some questions here, and folks, please feel free to add any other questions as we're going through this. So first question, Dave, is the timeline for denning changing with changing amounts of snow and warmer weather?
Yeah, it's kind of tough to say. So I know down south, they don't often try to do any work with their bears with yearlings. So we still try to capture our females with yearlings, basically because further south they stay active all winter. Um, we have seen, so I know right now that there are at least 4 to 5 females that we have that are still active with their 1-year-old cubs. So we are seeing that. Like last year, I had a den with newborn cubs, and this is still relatively early in the season. We think we've got tons of time. It was a nice warm day, and she was in a nice burrow den. These are the dens we love. There's a high chance of capture, and she's 20 feet out of the den with the cubs already. So it does change their patterns a little bit, and does seem like it is changing their patterns a little bit.
And are you kind of following up on that? Is there research out there that talks about that actually empirically looks at bird feeders and winter activity of bears and how that impacts that?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily. I think anecdotally, I mean, I will say that some of the bears that we have that are active are in completely natural places. So, for example, in the quad bears that are really truly quabbin bears, where they're fully forested bears feeding on natural foods and still staying active. So it's not simply and I guess I wouldn't say that we've seen that except for the last really 2 or 3 years that we've started to see a little bit of that. Previously, when we had females that were active, it was in suburban areas. And when we were tracking them, you knew that they'd kind of rest up for a little bit in one place, then go feed and hit bird feeders, and you could track them in the snow as they did this, and then go rest up again, and then do it again. So, anecdotally, we know that that's what those bears were doing. I think, unfortunately, bird feeders are so ubiquitous out there that it'd be kind of tough to key in on that, with anything. But as I said, we do have some bears that are completely natural areas that are remaining active.
Interesting. Yeah. And another question in this series of questions, but had to do, I think, with the issue just over the Mass line with the bears, with no huntings of bears down in Connecticut. And the question is asking for you to expand on hunting and aggressive bears. Are aggressive bears more likely to be hunted? Do hunters try to get larger bears, or are bears more cautious with the hunting season? It's a lot there, but kind of all
Yep.
related, I think.
Yeah, I think I don't want to imply that the hunting season allows you to target those individual bears necessarily. Um, I think, in some circumstances, certainly you could. If there was a bear in an area and a hunter was having, people in an area were having issues, and then they said, they knew some hunters and they went out to try to hunt that area specifically, maybe they could remove that bear. I think it's more just simply a kind of by chance thing. It's like over time, if those bears are those more aggressive, those bolder bears, that their behaviors may potentially make them more susceptible to being removed. And therefore, kind of just by chance, they're removed over time. And again, females that learn these behaviors and then raise litter after litter after litter of cubs, she's teaching those same behaviors to her cubs. So if that female persists in the population for a very long time, she can have an influence on many, many bears. If she happens to be removed in a state where there happens to be hunting, that kind of cuts that off and doesn't allow that to persist. So I think it is more of kind of a chance thing, but I think it really seems to. So I participate in it's not just for bears. I participate in another meeting for fur bearers. Our deer biologist does. So it's a meeting with biologists across the entire Northeast. So that's Maine down to Virginia and West Virginia. And we have annual meetings, and we talk about this. And Connecticut obviously is one of the states that we're looking at a lot right now, because they really are this much of an outlier. In the level of conflict is significantly higher than any other states with much higher bear densities, and just it's really is a truly an outlier. And other evidence for that is New Jersey. For political reasons, periodically New Jersey's hunting season gets stopped. When they do that, they'll watch as conflict rates absolutely skyrocket. The hunting season is initiated again, and those conflict rates drop right back down. It's then stopped again for political reasons, and the conflicts. This has happened a number of times in New Jersey, so there actually is data out there. It's not just one point that points to it. Really supporting the idea that there is a benefit for hunting in terms of limiting some of these more extreme levels of conflict. What were the other portions of that, Brad?
Do hunters try to get larger bears, and do bears get more cautious with the hunting season, which I guess you kind of covered there?
Yeah, and I don't think so. I mean, like, unfortunately, if a bear is hunted, it's the lesson has been learned there. I think, there are some hunters that will certainly target a large bear, but also knowing from talking to hunters that once you take a large bear, you will never take a large bear again. It's basically it's a monumental task to get the animal out of the woods. Quite frank, I mean, one of the things about bears is that their fat has a very strong taste. And so those big bears have lots of fat on them. And so quite often hunters will actually target the more moderate sized bears in their hunting seasons.
And do you see, so I know, hunting can be a controversial topic for some folks. And I wonder if you could speak a little to that and kind of the importance of hunting on especially this growing bear population that we have.
Yep. No, there's no question that that bear hunting can be controversial. So, for example, the management of the species that I do in Massachusetts have been impacted by public opinions about hunting as well as trapping. So back in 1996, there was a ballot referendum in Massachusetts. It made the traps that were effective for catching many furbearer species illegal in Massachusetts. And it also made the use of bait or hounds for hunting bears illegal. So that one ballot referendum greatly impacted my ability as a manager to manage any of these species. And so I'll give a couple of examples of how it does. And I'll say at the time when that ballot referendum happened, baiting was already prohibited by regulation. That our agency had passed this regulation, but it was legal at the time to hunt with hounds. So in terms of my ability to manage the population, those are two tools that do make it easier to hunt a bear, if you had either bait or hounds. And so I don't have those. And so that limits the number of bears that we can actually take in our hunting season. So if I need to increase the number of bears we take in our hunting season, the only tools I really have are to increase the length of the season or potentially to allow bears or hunters to take an additional bear or something like that. So it can be a challenge from that standpoint. In terms of trapping, we basically have no ability to manage many of those species. So, for example, if coyotes bite someone, as has happened a number of times in recent years in Massachusetts. So, for example, the town of Arlington, coyotes bit 3 children in a short period of time. And we didn't have any ability to try to remove that coyote that was doing that because they won't enter a box trap. So we use hunting, trapping as wildlife managers. Those are the tools we use to regulate the population. It is my responsibility, and I take this responsibility very seriously, to ensure that our hunting and trapping seasons do not have detrimental impacts on our population. I assure everyone here that, if there was any indication that bear hunting was causing issues for our bear population, I would propose regulations to change that, to make the hunting regulations stricter so that, our bears, we can have a healthy bear population, that people who want to watch bears can watch bears. People who just like simply knowing that there are bears out there can do that. But those that do want to hunt bears and take advantage of that can do so as well. So those are the tools that we may use to manage these wildlife species. Otherwise, they would become overly abundant. And we've seen this, for example, that ballot referendum greatly inhibited our ability to regulate the beaver population. The beaver population exploded, and now conflict resulted. So beaver are now largely seen, despite being a hugely important ecological species, seen as a nuisance by the public. And so this is where managing these populations within the bounds that the public can tolerate, cultural carrying capacity is what this is called, is important, and hunting and trapping allow us to do that.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah. And I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. That's and having that information available for folks. Kind of on the hunting front, one question just came up. Are there any examples in the Northeast of bears being harvested for wildlife trafficking purposes, such as for bear gallbladder or other body
Yep.
parts?
No, it was a concern. I mean, this is well before my time. That was a concern at one point. It doesn't appear to be at this point a concern. It's obviously something that we would keep track of, but that doesn't seem to be a current concern that as much as it was 20 or 30 years ago. I don't know the exact timing of when that was a major issue.
Okay, great, great. And a question I had, so bears, I mean, it's amazing to see how ubiquitous and abundant they are in the landscape. Those dots, that you showed, and that just being a subset of just the females, right? So if people are out hiking in the woods and they do encounter a bear, could you
Yep.
talk about kind of behaviors and what people should do?
Yep. And I will I kind of said this at one point when I was showing that level of interaction there. Just a reminder to people, because I will hear in these presentations that someone suddenly I won't go out in the woods anymore. I don't want to take my dog for a walk or whatever. Just remember that people are, as I said, they're jogging, they're riding on bike trails, they're hiking in the woods, they're doing everything that we do in modern society every single day, and we don't have serious encounters. Should you encounter a bear, whether it's on a trail in the woods, it's in your yard, your neighborhood, the important thing is to give it space. So we often run into this issue in Eastern Mass where bears are novel there. And so if people start hearing reports, they tend to flock to the bear because they want to try to see it. So if you have a bear in your yard, don't try to get out to get a selfie, get closer, or that kind of thing. Give it space. Allow it to just move on. If it's feeding on something, let it feed on it. And when it's done, it will move on, clean whatever it is up afterwards. And just generally speaking, letting the bear know that you're there. So if you are in the yard and you see a bear, you're gardening, for example, and a bear comes in the yard, just, hey, bear, I'm over here. I'm minding my own business. Don't bother me, just so it knows you're a person. It doesn't get closer before it realizes you're there, and then it can be startled. And that's, like I said before, it's kind of that proximity where all of a sudden you can be perceived as a threat because you're so close to it. And so if you're out hiking and things, that's kind of the thing too. You suddenly encounter a bear that's 50 yards down the trail, just saying, hey, bear, this is me here. Just letting you know I'm here. I'm now and then back away from the bear. So increase the space between you and the bear. Keep your eye on it so you can see what it's going to do. More than likely, it's just going to wander off. I will say that there are occasions where occasionally black bears can exhibit predatory behaviors towards people. It's very rare that this happens, but it has happened. And so if a bear is ever persistently following you on the trail, it's you try to scare it off, it stops, and it just keeps coming. It's fine. You're trying to get away down the trail, and it just keeps coming and coming and coming. You need to try to get out of there, as without running, as quickly as you can. That's a bear you want to avoid. It's showing interest in you for some unknown reason, and that would be something we'd want to have reported to us, just so we know what's going on. If someone is uncomfortable about the idea of going out and recreating with bears around, there's products called bear spray. It's really designed for grizzly brown bears, so much more aggressive, much larger bears out west. It's designed basically, should you have an encounter, it puts out a spray of pepper spray out to about 20, 30 feet. You spray it in a Z in front of you. It kind of makes a wall of pepper spray between you and the animal, and it gives you the opportunity to leave that situation. So that can be something that you could purchase and carry on yourself, just as kind of an insurance policy if you feel uncomfortable about it. I saw something pop up in the chat in terms of unleashed dogs. we never recommend dogs are off leash. Most state parks and other places require dogs to be on a leash. But it's often the dog that will initiate any kind of negative encounter. We don't have issues with bears, coming into backyards and attacking dogs or anything like that. It tends to be the bear's in the yard, something like that. Dog gets out, the dog goes flying after that bear. It chases it to a tree. Then the bear realizes, I outweigh you by 150 pounds, and the dog has a bad day. Quite frankly, whether it's a bear, but quite more often with coyotes, is where we tend to see the serious negative incidents with dogs, because they're off leash. They interact with a pack of coyotes, particularly in the spring, when coyotes are denning, and dogs can get torn up pretty good because coyotes will be defensive of their den and their pups. So the recommendation is that your dogs are always on a leash under your control to prevent that kind of interaction with wildlife, so they're not chasing other wildlife, that kind of thing.
That's great points. Yeah, I know in the conservation area I'm on the board of in Northampton, we had some issues with, there was a dog that was off leash that treated a bear, and as you said, the dog had a bad day. We'll put it at that, and the poor bear as well. I mean, you think,
Right.
just out being a bear, and all of a sudden gets chased, and so appreciate also, yeah, the point on coyotes as well. Again, they're a wild animal, right? And they're in their element. And
I should say, I mean, just for, again, don't have this issue, but hey, we're here. I'm talking to you. We do have a lot of reports of coyotes attacking dogs, unsupervised dogs in yards. That electric fence that people have keeps your dog in. It does not keep the coyote out. And so it's common. It's very common for coyotes to attack dogs. So the recommendation there is, it's your presence next to your dog on a leash is what's going to prevent that from happening. So it really is important to protect your pets when they're outside, because there are animals that can hurt them.